And the first movement is this: a woman. That's the first movement. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God in which she will be nourished for 1,260 days. So John specifically points out in verse 1 that this is a sign. And then in verse 3, he specifically says again, another sign. A sign is something that is external, that stands in place of or signifies something else. It is not that thing, right? If you see a sign on the road and it says, sharp turn ahead, the sign itself is not the sharp turn. Does that make sense? So it is something that refers to or stands in place of so that you can see what something else is. So since John is very specific and tells us this is a sign, we know for sure that this woman isn't a woman. Okay, it's a sign. The sign is standing in place of that. And so we don't need to run around willy-nilly trying to figure out exactly and try and force our ideas and opinions and maybe our lifestyle choices and our pet theologies onto this sign. We need to look at the sign and we need to tell us and figure out what the sign is pointing to. That being said, if this woman is a sign, again, it's not an actual woman, but what is it? What does this sign signify for us? Additionally, what's the dragon? And then in verse 5, it doesn't tell us that this is a sign, so I take this to mean that this is not a sign. Verse 5 is a child, a male child. So who's the male child? And we're going to take these out of order because I think it's really going to help us to take them out of order. And what's really most helpful for us to be able to ascertain, especially the woman, is to figure out who the child is. So again, look at verse 5. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Now I think it's very clear, and maybe you'll think this is clear too, just by reading that this has to signify Jesus. The child is Jesus in this passage. And I think that's very clear. Now, I would love for this to signify the church. And some people have posited, the vast majority have said this is the child, or that Jesus is the child. But there's been a few that have said, no, I think this is the church. And it certainly would fit my pet theology of pre-tribulational rapture. And so that's why I would love for it to fit this sign or this child somehow. But again, we don't want to force our pet theologies to fit Scripture. We want to actually let Scripture tell us what it's saying. And nearly every commentator, as I said, agrees that this is Jesus Christ, who indeed is caught up to God and to his throne. It's the only option that really fits snugly into all of the surrounding data and material in the passage. So defining the child then is going to help us to understand who the woman is. Because as we see in verse 5, this woman gives birth to the child. Now, because it says that she gives birth to this child, it has led to some theologians to some erroneous conclusions. This must be the Mother Mary. After all, she physically gave birth to Jesus, but she doesn't fit any of the rest of the passage. If we look at all of the clues in the surrounding verses, Mary doesn't fit that at all. And in fact, John tells us the woman is a sign, which means she's not an actual woman. She signifies something. So look at verse 1 again. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Now this seems very odd unless you know Genesis really well. And if you go back to Genesis chapter 37, you see the sun, moon, and all of these stars appearing together as they relate in Joseph's dreams. This is what gets Joseph into hot water with his family. He tells them a dream that God had, that God gave to him. And he goes to his brothers and he says, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And by the way, the answer to that question is yes. But you can see there that Jacob has clearly interpreted the dream. He's got it right. The dream means that the whole family is going to bow down before Joseph. And he understands the significance of each one of the signs. Jacob, Israel, is the sun. Joseph's mother is the moon. And the 12 stars would be the 12 sons. Well, there's only 11 in this passage, but obviously Joseph represents the 12th. The 12 sons that establish the tribes of Israel. So when we see this woman here in Revelation 12, and we see the same symbols, I think we're supposed to conclude that this woman is the nation of Israel. The descendants of Jacob and his 12 sons are there in all of those signs. And we don't have to complicate it. We just let Scripture tell us that because Scripture interprets Scripture. Verse 2, it says, "She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth." And now again, these are signs. We've established that this was Israel, and therefore the pregnancy is the long-awaited Messiah. It's not easy to be the chosen nation. And throughout Hebrew scriptures, Israel is often depicted as a woman in the midst of birth pangs. In fact, one of the passages that we always point to in Micah, where we point to and say, this is how they knew where Jesus was going to be born, where the Messiah was going to be born in Bethlehem, goes on to say Israel has been in birth pains awaiting its long-awaited Messiah. See, Israel was in birth pains because it was the chosen nation. And its birth pains were things like being dragged off into captivity and being forced to endure being occupied by another empire. Those would be the birth pains. And there are numerous references in the prophets to all of those birth pains, signifying the suffering of Israel as it awaits its Messiah. And then we have another sign in verse 3. Another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. Aha! Says the casual reader. We know who this is. There's only one nation today that classifies and defines itself and uses a dragon in all of its literature. Wales. You didn't know that Wales uses the dragon in all of its literature, but it does. See, this is what we do. We come into Scripture and we impose our current events on Scripture and we say, well, isn't it clear who this could possibly be? Our rival must associates itself with a dragon, so therefore here's a dragon and it's a sign, so it must be our rival. But it's not. Don't read into Scripture. Let Scripture interpret itself. And thank goodness, Scripture does so for us really close to our passage. John himself tells us who this is. Look at verse 9. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. Now, as a teacher of the word, I love verses like this. It makes my job so easy. Go ahead, try and argue with me on this one. So I can say confidently the dragon is Satan, right? John calls him the ancient serpent, the devil, Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. People today make one of two errors in general about this dragon. They either say, on the one hand, that he's a myth. He doesn't exist. There's no devil. There's no person that's out there deceiving people and getting them to do evil things. Right? That just doesn't exist. In fact, if you travel in those circles, what you'll find is that usually it's academia that's telling you that this doesn't exist. We preclude the supernatural from the very beginning. We say all that exists is the natural world. That's all we can possibly know, and so therefore we're not even going to discuss the supernatural. The devil has to be supernatural, so therefore he can't exist. That's a logical fallacy. But the opposite side of that spectrum is equally in fault and has a similar but very different kind of problem. The opposite side of the spectrum says everything that we see in the world that's wrong or bad or evil or whatever we don't like must be the devil. It's like Saturday Night Live, the church lady, right? Could it be Satan? And so both of these are errors. One says there is no devil. The other ascribes every bad thing that ever occurred to anybody ever as the devil did it. But both are in error. Satan, the devil, definitely does exist. He's very real. He's very active. He is ascribed many things, and he's talked about in a variety of contexts throughout Scripture by various different authors. If we're going to trust in Scripture, then we have to trust, yes, indeed, Scripture says there is Satan, there is a devil, and he is active in the world. He is ever engaged in carrying out his subtle, sneaky work of deceiving the whole world. Jesus says this about him in John chapter 8. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. You see, his lies include making you believe that he doesn't exist. That's one of the lies. C.S. Lewis goes into great depth in the Screwtape Letters on this. One of the great lies that he persists in is trying to make sure that people understand that he doesn't exist. Get them comfortable. Make sure that they don't think about the supernatural. Make them think that the supernatural doesn't exist. Oh, Wormtail. But on the flip side of that coin, the other lie that he constantly persists in is making you believe that he is so powerful, so dangerous, that you live in fear of him. I'm so glad we sang Outnumbered today. Both are errors, and in both cases, the lies serve to allow him to rule. I'm either so afraid I can't stand up to him, or he doesn't exist and I don't stand up to him. Now, notice in our passage that Satan isn't in charge of hell, as all the comic strips always depict him, right? This, fork-tailed guy with a trident and horns, and he's red. I don't know why he's always like that. That's how the comic strips, right? He's always in amongst the flames, right? He is not that way. He's not even in the lake of fire yet. And he's not from the abyss. We looked at that a couple of weeks ago. There is a demon that comes from the abyss that's in charge of a whole bunch of demons, but that is not Satan. He will be soon locked there for 1,000 years, but he's not there yet. As we said last week, he's currently the god of this world. He's the usurper. But as we're going to see, his days are drawing to a close.